Welcome to EconTalk, brought to you by the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University. My guest today is Ed Glaeser, the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard University. Professor Glaeser's research and writings take in a wide variety of topics in political economy, from why Americans are obese to the role of cities in economic growth. Ed, I'd like to talk to you today about paternalism, the idea that some people know what's best for you, or can judge your self-interest better than you can judge it yourself. Recently, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein have argued that given recent findings in behavioral economics, the interface between psychology and economics, even a libertarian should favor some form of government regulation that would be paternalistic in its nature. And you disagree, so tell us about that debate.
Well, I think the starting point for this is indeed behavioral economics, is indeed the recognition of the flaws in human cognition and the flaws in our decision-making. And I think there's absolutely no question that we are a highly imperfect species. Certainly, from my own personal experience, I know I screw up all the time. But just recognizing the flaws in mankind is not a justification for state action or paternalism. Adam Smith, 230 years ago, was well aware of the flaws of mankind. The case for laissez-faire, the sort of central insight of the Wealth of Nations, is the limits on government and the fact that government's interests are not necessarily aligned with those of people. And I think as one recognizes psychology, one recognizes sort of the flaws of humankind, the key question is, are the errors inherent in state decision-making going to be greater or lesser than the errors involved in individual decision-making? And I think the libertarian view is that the track record for state decision-making is not fantastic. For any number of reasons, which hopefully we'll have a chance to talk over further. In fact, recognizing the flaws of human decision-making should make us less willing to let the state make our decisions for us, not more. Because we come to recognize how flawed, state decision-making is going to be.
Well, Thaler and Sunstein, in their piece in the American Economic Review, give an example. I don't find it very compelling. I know you don't either, but let me lay it out for our listeners. The idea would be a cafeteria owner is trying to decide whether to put the fruit first in the line or the ice cream. And if you put the fruit first, evidently, the claim is, I don't know if this is true, but let's assume it is true. If you put the fruit first, people take the fruit. They'll do what's good for them. But if you put the ice cream first, they just can't resist the temptation. They'll take the ice cream. And so a loving, kind cafeteria owner who's looking out for the customer's well-being would put the fruit first. And surely there's nothing wrong with that. And similarly, government, when it has an opportunity, should steer us away from temptation and toward our own best interest. Do you think that's a fair description of what they're trying to argue?
Well, I think it's one aspect of it. I mean, part of the problem is that it's not always clear what they're talking about in terms of soft paternalism. Particularly, I think Thaler tends to move back and forth between soft paternalism as practiced by firms and soft paternalism as practiced by businesses, right?
Make the distinction between soft and hard paternalism. What is that? What do those terms mean?
So soft paternalism means you're not actually restricting choices. Hard paternalism actually means we're actually imposing a tax. We're actually really changing your budget set in a way that classical economists would understand. We're telling you can't eat the ice cream, or we're going to put a $10 gallon tax on ice cream. Soft paternalism is some question of either changing what the default rules are, or something like warning labels on cigarette packages, things that are not meant to actually change the hard reality on the ground, but change the way that you mentally approach the decision.
Reminds me a little bit of state-run liquor stores in certain states. They're Spartan, unattractive, and perhaps deliberately so. I don't think so. I think they're just poorly run. But I think you could argue that they're deliberately unattractive. The whiskey is displayed in unattractive ways because, after all, liquor is bad for you, and it's for your own good that we make it unattractive to roam the shelves.
Right. That is certainly that could be interpreted. Although I stand more closely with your interpretation of state-run liquor stores, that could be interpreted as one example of soft paternalism. So there are a number of ways in which sort of they propose these policies, And one set of it, which I think we should just get off the table to begin with, because libertarians have no problem with private soft paternalism, in the sense if a firm hires workers and then wants to encourage them to exercise, people are making decisions across firms. That's not, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Firms do all sorts of crazy things with their workers to try and, get them to act in certain ways.
And they compete in offering attractive packages to attract workers who might want to be constrained if they so desire.
Absolutely, right. And no libertarian in the world thinks that you either should stop firms from being able to do that, or, it isn't obvious to me whether or not firms should do more or less of it. The normal economics view is that they're doing probably the right amount.
Right.
And in the same sense, presumably restaurants also compete in offering healthy alternatives. I mean, the private cafeteria owners, people really would like to be constrained by or would like to have the fruit offered first. The private firms will compete and will develop a reputation for healthy food. So that stuff is really not a type of soft paternalism that's controversial, and we should really only focus our conversation, I think, on soft paternalism when the state does it.
Absolutely. Good point.
And I guess there are a couple of different versions of this. So one of which is changing defaults. And it's hard to, this differs in different ways. And sometimes, the state, there's going to be one default, right? And as soon as there's one default, then we're in a debate about what the default should be. And in that case, sort of changing the default doesn't feel to me like any more or less paternalism. So, if the state has to put one food first and it's going to choose between ice cream and fruit, I don't know that putting fruit is particularly more paternalistic than putting ice cream. The question to me is more when the state actually increases the scope of its activities, when it actually aggressively goes out and tries, as in the case of cigarettes, to make the product seem less attractive, to make people feel like they're less interested in buying it, to in some sense try and change people's minds about things.
So we might have a range between the soft paternalism, which would be the warning label or a ban on attractive people in advertisements that have cigarettes, right? A whole set of things like that, up to taxation, up to a total ban, and
Absolutely.
The latter would be hard paternalism.
Absolutely, and probably if you gave me my druthers, I'd prefer soft paternalism to hard paternalism. But there are good reasons to be suspicious about governmental soft paternalism when it significantly increases the scope of government activity. And in this paper of mine that's published in the Chicago Law Review, I go through a number of arguments about why I think soft paternalism is in fact a far from obviously benign strategy. That in fact libertarians should not necessarily embrace government warning labels on all sorts of things.
But it sounds attractive because after all, the warning label, you're free to ignore it. It seems you still have the freedom in that world to buy the cigarettes or the alcohol. It says on the alcohol label you shouldn't drink this if you're pregnant or if you're operating heavy equipment, which I do all the time. So I'm really glad it's there. It's a big red flag for me. But seriously, the claim would be that what's the big deal? Come on. So they're just providing this information. That's good for you. You'll have it. You're free to use it or ignore it. So why do you think that's dangerous?
Well, I think we should start with the fact that it's not actually information per se, or at least the standard economic view of what information is has very little to do with cigarette warning labels, right? I mean, cigarette warning labels are not just providing people with sort of neutral information about things. It's making you feel bad about this consumption decision that you're making, and that shows up in lots of cases like this. Particularly, sort of the stronger that you want those warning labels to be, the skull and crossbones or the damaged fetus, for example, on the cigarette package. Those things are incredibly powerful emotional taxes in some sense on consumption. The whole point of it is you're making people feel bad about consuming the product. And in some sense, classic economics guides us to the idea that a tax without revenues is probably a bad thing, right? So you're making people feel bad about consuming the product, and the government isn't actually getting anything from it. I mean, there's no actually offsetting tax. So the starting point is you're making people feel bad about smoking or eating or what have you. You're lowering their utility from consumption, and you ain't getting any offsetting taxes the way you would be in a standard hard paternalism case.
That argument is simply then that a tax, a formal government tax, is more efficient than the use of stigma because it generates tax revenue. The government can do something productive, presumably, with it. But you also don't believe that the warning label itself is a good idea, even as it's not just on efficiency grounds.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the second argument that I have against soft paternalism is that soft paternalism can cause bad decisions just as easily as hard paternalism can, right? I mean, the sort of starting point for paternalism is that the government makes better decisions than private individuals do. Just accepting that private individuals screw up doesn't mean that, the government is any more perfect. Governments are themselves decided by voters, and there's lots of reasons to believe that voters make a better decision about things that they do regularly, about decisions that are simple, like, deciding what razor to buy or deciding what ice cream to buy. Those decisions are a heck of a lot easier than going into a voting booth and deciding something. And it's hard to think of an area of human decision-making that seems to me, at least, to be more fraught with confusion and error than political decisions. The extent to which the historical record is full of people, believing nonsense, voting on nonsense, voting for enormously self-destructive things. I mean, just think of sort of, Weimar and an overwhelming majority of German citizens voting for either the Nazis or the communists, right? This is not necessarily a great track record for decision-making in the voting booth, and that's not something traditional economics is uncomfortable with. After all, in a voting decision, you don't have the incentive to get it right. It's both a hard decision and a decision that rolls together lots of different things, and it's one in which there are actors, the politicians, the parties, the 501c3s, that are strongly incentivized to get you to make the wrong decision, just as incentivized as cigarette companies are. Once you've got this view that public decision-making is certainly no guarantee for error-free decision-making, then allowing a government to interfere with decision-making through soft or hard paternalism has either possibility, has equal possibility for error.
So you're saying that even though people believe and sometimes profess stupid ideas, most of those ideas that we profess that are foolish, say a belief in astrology, to take an example many of our listeners may be comfortable with calling foolish. Maybe some won't be, but a belief in astrology usually doesn't have very harmful consequences. It may give people pleasure, so we see astrology columns in newspapers. If you buy a car that is unfit for you, if you have a family of 5 children and you buy a compact car, you find out pretty quickly that you made a mistake and you adjust accordingly. We understand people make mistakes when they buy their cars, but voting has very little feedback involved in the decision. If you make a bad vote or a good vote, your vote counts so little. Your incentive, therefore, to acquire the information to make a wise choice is so small. Wouldn't we expect people to make bad voting decisions?
Absolutely.
And you find evidence of extraordinary ignorance, don't you? As does my colleague Brian Kaplan here, of people being misinformed and ill-informed. Give us a couple examples of those.
Well, you can choose any side of the political aisle on this, right? So if you want to take the sort of on the right-wing side, you can look at the share of people who believe that who doubt that Arab terrorists destroyed the World Trade Center. Now, Americans are pretty much sure that Arab terrorists had something to do with blowing up the World Trade Center. Only 7% of Americans don't believe that Arab terrorists destroyed the World Trade Center. By contrast, 89% of Kuwaitis believe that Arab terrorists did not blow up the World Trade Center. Throughout the Middle East, there's sort of a vast number of people that believe, in fact, that Mossad or other groups actually were involved in destroying the World Trade Center. Now, your approach to that tragedy is wildly different, obviously, depending upon what you believe. Within the U.S., there is a wide difference in regions in the extent to which people believe that Saddam Hussein was involved in the World Trade Center bombings. That's upwards of 50% in some regions of the country and below 40% in others. Again, sort of a factual question. I'm not sure that we know entirely what the right answer is, but a factual question, and one in which there's clearly one of the two sides is wrong. A third case, which I think is absolutely fascinating, is the differences in beliefs about poverty and effort between the U.S. and Europe. So 60% of Americans believe that the poor are lazy. Only 26% of Europeans believe that the poor are lazy. By contrast, 60% of Europeans think that the poor are trapped in poverty, but only 29% of Americans share that opinion. Now,
they could both be right, because the differences between American poor people and European poor people or European economic upward mobility and American, but I don't think that's the main
reason. It could be right, but it isn't, and it's even easier to see in terms of the laziness than in the income mobility thing, right? The American poor work significantly harder than much of the European poor do, right? It shouldn't surprise anyone who knows about differences in work hours between the U.S. and Europe.
Right.
But in fact, if one group of the poor look lazy, it's not the American poor, it's the European poor. In terms of income mobility, there's an ongoing debate about this, but I would certainly say that no one has really managed to show that there's any significant increase in exiting the bottom quintile of the U.S. income distribution, any increase in that within the U.S. than within Europe. That the Europeans, are in fact slightly more likely to get out of poverty than the Americans do. So the fact that Americans believe that the poor aren't trapped, but Europeans do believe that they're trapped, again, that difference doesn't appear to be explained by reality. I think a better explanation is what we're taught in schools, and both sides are guilty of indoctrination here for understandable reasons. But the prevailing message of American schools to this day is that we live in a land of opportunity, that by working hard you can rise. And the prevailing message in Europe in the 20th century has been, the Marxist message that class barriers are hard, that, it all depends on where you're born into, that you can't do anything to leave your class. And these two educational systems have their effect and create wildly different beliefs, even though those beliefs don't have any connection with the economic reality.
I like the statistic you give in your article in Regulation magazine about foreign aid versus Medicare expenditure.
Yes.
Was it 63% of respondents in 1998 in a Pew poll thought that the U.S. spends more on foreign aid than on Medicare? 63%. They're not close either. It's not like, people could be misinformed.
No, they're wildly different.
Yeah, Medicare is billions and many-fold higher than foreign aid.
Right.
So what the insight I like that you have here, so it isn't just that governments, quote, make mistakes too, like people do, which is certainly true. Politicians are misinformed, certainly sometimes, like people are. There's really a much more sinister and frightening and dangerous issue when you give government the mandate to try to encourage people to, quote, do the right thing. And that is that government's incentive on that side is going to be manipulated by, I think, what you call belief suppliers. Talk about that for a minute, because I think that's what you're coming to just now. It's really a very important point.
Right. I think that the sort of central lesson to me of psychology is that our beliefs are enormously manipulable, that we actually believe things most of the time because we've been told them, not because we've actually seen hard evidence on them. Obviously, a particularly strong example of this is the set of religious beliefs that we have, that people have enormously strong beliefs about religious questions in which there's, shall we say, very little hard data. And once you recognize that beliefs are formed by our friends, our neighbors, what we hear, what we read, it then puts suggests a huge role for the suppliers of belief, for entrepreneurs, be they ministers, be they politicians, be they just, friends out there to convince other friends, who then are actually the actors who help change people's beliefs. So, historically, there have been this whole array of people who recognize that there are profits, opportunities, political strength to be gained by convincing people of things. This is the way I see this market working out, and this is why I think economics has so much to add to psychology, is that the only way that you understand a market is by thinking about the interaction between supply and demand. And only by sort of thinking about beliefs being formed by suppliers' beliefs and interacting with consumers can you actually make sense of the things that we believe. And in any sensible model like this, you come up with a view that you expect to see more errors when you have highly incentivized suppliers interacting with unincentivized consumers. Now, in the case of buying ice cream or razor blades, consumers have a fairly strong incentive to get it right. It's not all that easy to convince guys that, some crappy razor is incredibly good to use, because after all, you have to put up with a crappy razor and you get instant feedback on it. In the case of politics, you both have strongly incentivized suppliers who really want to capture government, who really want to win elections so that they can impose their own policies. At the same time, interacting with citizens who, really don't have strong incentives to figure out if we spend more on Medicaid or foreign aid. I mean, it's not like that knowledge is going to make some huge difference in terms of their everyday life. So why should they go out and undergo the pain and suffering of actually figuring out where those dollars are being spent? And as a result, I think that the policy world is one in which there's tremendous scope for error because of these suppliers, because you have these highly incentivized suppliers, pushing around the beliefs. I think things like the Medicaid foreign aid case are one example. The case of the socialist teachers unions in Europe that took over the curriculum in the middle of the 20th century and convinced people that they lived in a class-bound society or another.
Yeah, and the point here, I think, is one point is that we'd expect fruit growers to really encourage the consumption of fruit, perhaps well beyond any claim for health benefits that would truly be in a person's self-interest. Having said that, I think it's important to note that there's a certain Puritanism here at work that is, even when it's well-intentioned, which I find deeply offensive. I'm going to botch the Mencken quote, but it's Mencken said something along the lines of, Puritanism is the haunting fear that someone somewhere is having a good time. And this idea that somehow ice cream, again, just to come back to this example, ice cream is somehow dangerous and that you shouldn't be enjoying it, or that you enjoy it too much, is really a pernicious road. It certainly would encourage people, the government, if you accept this view, discouraging car travel, air travel, skiing, virtually everything. And I think the economic perspective here that's important to keep in mind is that everything is dangerous. That's the essence of the economic way of thinking. It's not a 0-1, safe or not. It's a continuum, and we choose along that continuum to smoke, to ski, to take certain jobs, to take certain kinds of vacations based on information that we have about our own preferences that others do not have. It's a very Hayekian perspective to be skeptical of the ability of the government, even if well-intentioned, even if not subject to these belief suppliers, that knowledge is available to a central authority about those relative desires and costs.
Right. And you have the existence of, some groups are, so the fruit growers we think of as being sort of, obviously narrowly, self-interested promoting their own product. But you also have other interest groups that are, basically well-meaning, but they're just so indoctrinated in the belief structure of their own, profession that they end up thinking that their objectives are the only ones that count. I'm thinking mainly here about the health industry, the medical industry.
Great example.
Which, I've never met a doctor who really doesn't think that maximizing longevity is the goal or maximizing health is the goal. But obviously it's not the goal, as you emphasize. We make trade-offs all the time on, longevity versus other pleasures. And, the sort of medical tendency to think that the objective is to maximize lifespan is, I think, something that really does need to be tempered with the view that it's both quality and quantity of life that matters.
Sure. A friend of mine broke his leg in a motorcycle accident. And by the way, I find motorcycles absolutely terrifying, and I hope my children don't ride them. But this friend loved riding a motorcycle, and we went to the doctor to get his leg fixed. The doctor actually said to him, "Now look, I'm going to fix your leg, but only on the condition you promise you'll never get on a motorcycle again." And he said, "What do you mean? I like riding a motorcycle." It's a different worldview. Let's leave it at that. And you're right. They lobby well-intentioned, perhaps, but it doesn't take in the full range of human activity.
Yeah. There is a potential issue which I haven't quite figured out where exactly I stand on, which is forget about sort of paternalism. There are externalities related to committing suicide. Right, almost every person has a sort of web of personal networks that you cause a huge amount of pain to those people around you by killing yourself. And so I haven't quite decided whether or not I'm completely on board with sort of saying that every form of suicidal action should be unfettered by government intervention. But I think if you think about sort of things from this perspective and sort of you start with the view that basically people know what's good for yourself, then you're sort of ending up limiting yourself to thinking about the cases where there's associated with the action.
Well, let's talk about that. Let me give you a different perspective. Although I'm certainly willing to cede to you, if your only soft paternalism embrace is to discourage suicide, we'll probably be okay. But as philosophical soulmates, but think about the following. I think it's against the law to commit suicide, or at least it is in some places.
It is certainly, yeah.
And presumably justified by this externality argument. You'd have to ask, what's the virtue of that? What's the effectiveness of that law? A lot of these soft paternalistic arguments, even if you could make the case that they are improvements, right? You've been making the argument that there are a lot of reasons to think that government will choose bad examples, take bad paths, even if well-intentioned in the paternalism area. But suppose they took good paths. Suppose, and I want to come to this issue of cigarettes, which you concede and many believe is an example where government soft paternalism was successful. One of the costs of even accepting these so-called good examples of soft paternalism is it crowds out private paternalism. It crowds out social norms, moralizing, culture, and other methods that would spring to the fore in the absence of government sanctions of these kinds. So when the government takes a large role in cigarettes, say, or in nutrition, which it has done for a while, and I think is going to get worse at, it basically leaves the field, very little room in the field for private efforts that are inherently going to be more competitive and presumably could produce, and I believe would produce, better outcomes than the government monopoly on paternalism, or essentially not a monopoly literally, but their dominance in the field, their taking of funding for those sources away from private opportunities.
I agree with that, and I think the case of obesity makes this really clear, right? I mean, if we think about where the solutions for obesity are going to come from, it's going to come from the private market. It's going to come from the fact that Americans want to be thinner, and there is a vast diet industry that caters to that. There's a battle, obviously, because at the same time the diet industry has become more competitive. You also have a decrease in the time price of food, which I've at least argued is what lies behind the rise in obesity. So it's not obvious which way technology will go in the short run, but I sort of have no doubt in the long run that the answer to this is not going to come from government sanctions on what we eat or government soft paternalism, but it's going to come from entrepreneurs like Atkins or Pritzker or Jenny Craig or whatever, figuring out ways to solve this. So I completely agree with this, and I think it's also true that we have a millennia-long tradition of private entrepreneurs of social norms, trying to figure out how to craft societies that people then can sort of voluntarily enter in, voluntarily restraining themselves and sort of committing to living in a better way. I think that's right. But I think also in terms of having, and let me come back to the suicide case, I think it is better in terms of having this argument in the public sphere to sort of accept that there's try and talk about what you think the objective is. What would any benevolent government paternalism program talk about, and that at least show why so many of these paternalism things would fail by any reasonable criteria. So I think it's sort of very hard to even come to the discussion if you don't accept that there are some circumstances in which it might not be the worst thing to have a soft paternalism thing towards motorcycle helmets. But by the same token, once you look at motorcycle helmets and you sort of say, oh boy, there are really a lot of guys who die from this, and I'm not particularly signing off on a motorcycle helmet thing. I'm just trying to make the case of that versus ice cream, right? Ice cream has trivial mortality effects versus motorcycle helmets. If you think that sort of motorcycle helmets are close to the margin, then you can't possibly be in favor of regulating ice cream.
I accept that as a strategic point, but I think you make a nice point in your work on the slippery slope issue, that even in these areas where, quote, most people would agree that there's an argument here for soft paternalism, and the argument here would be, for example, that ex post, after the accident, most motorcycle riders express regret. Obviously, they wish they'd worn a helmet after the accident. However, they do enjoy the wind in their hair, so it is a little more complicated. But you also make the point that even in these cases where soft paternalism might seem attractive in practical grounds, it often leads to hard paternalism.
Oh, absolutely. Right. I mean, I think we see this in the case of cigarettes very, very strongly. Right. What started off as being minor intrusions gradually led to the demonizing of smoking, and at this point in time, widespread acceptance for large taxes and massive quantity controls. No, it's completely right.
Well, let's talk about the empirical side here, because right now up till now we've been talking about the theory. We've been saying there'd be reasons on theoretical grounds, information grounds, incentive grounds to be skeptical of government's ability to indulge in either soft or hard paternalism. But you give a nice set of examples in your regulation paper of the actual track record. So it's easy to point to the so-called successes, the stigmatization of smoking, which perhaps I believe, others believe, has gone too far in terms of the actual coercive effects of taxation. But what other examples do we have of governments indulging in soft paternalism in the United States?
Well,
or elsewhere?
I think there are lots of examples where the government has taken on various, lifestyle issues, often with pernicious effects. So, for example, there has been a centuries-old, government action. First, sort of hard paternalism. Now we're debating about soft paternalism about homosexuality, right? So currently, the sort of debate about calling gay unions marriage is fundamentally a soft paternalism debate, right? We're not fundamentally talking about sort of traditional hard paternalism, which involved in, locking homosexuals up, but we're talking about, something about sort of words, about trying to send a message that we like heterosexual marriages more than we like homosexual marriages. Now, this sort of thing is the kind of thing that opens up all the time when you have governmental paternalism, that, governments decide something that's a minority is something that's bad, and decide that they want to, engage in some form of paternalism against that action. I mean, I need not sort of, remind people of how much, say, for example, the Nazi regime was enormously fond of paternalistic policies.
No, please do remind our audience, because it's little known. It's little known, and it's very important.
Advocating for healthy exercise in the outdoors or various food-related things. Right? Hitler was a very big something of a food nut.
He was a vegetarian and proselytized about its virtues.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the historical track record of paternalism does not suggest some sort of benign state that has always chosen things that clearly have a very strong mortality effect. But, it's wandered afield into every form of human action, often with, quite disturbing results, right? I mean, the sort of vilification of homosexuals leads towards, much worse actions. And likewise, you can think about, the sort of anti-Semitism is starting as some form of soft paternalism against Jews and leading towards the gas chambers. So
I like the example you give of slavery in your regulation piece. We have an essay at the Library of Economics and Liberty by David Levy and Sandra Pert, and we'll put a link up to that essay. That essay explains that Thomas Carlyle called economics the dismal science, not because it was boring or led to pessimism, but because economists actually believed that Africans and other so-called allegedly inferior groups such as Jews or the Irish, economists believed those folks were capable of running their own lives. But writers such as Carlyle, Dickens, Ruskin disagreed. They thought Africans and others were inferior, and they justified slavery and racism on paternalistic grounds as a way to help these allegedly inferior people from themselves, as a paternalistic necessity. It's a very dangerous, pernicious slope to justify using coercive power as a way to help others whose self-control or reasonings deemed inadequate by the elite.
The essence of sort of, soft paternalism often involves vilifying people who do these things. Often vilifies, smokers as being irresponsible to themselves and harmful to others, vilifies gays, vilifies, people who aren't a member of the dominant religious group, this is a very slippery slope, and one that has led to a huge amount of human suffering.
And it's an interesting example, the externality issue, which I view as a theoretical nicety, but somewhat dangerous in practice, potentially very dangerous. The smoking issue, it wasn't just paternalism. It wasn't just that, oh well, you're hurting yourself. The secondhand smoke issue allowed the state to say, oh well, you're free to choose your own, poisons, but when you're starting to hurt others, we're going to regulate and coerce you accordingly. So what that has led to, I believe, is an overstatement of the effects of secondhand smoke by government health agencies in trying to assess its dangers. Secondhand smoke may actually be dangerous, but it's not as dangerous as the government says it is, and so this so-called benign provision of information often leads to more dangerous things.
Absolutely, I agree completely with that, and it also leads towards an overstatement of the actual personal health consequences of smoking, right? I mean, we all know Kip Viscusi's work suggesting that non-smokers think that smoking is actually more dangerous than it is.
And
I think that's totally right. I actually am more convinced by in terms of smoking, which actually I'm not signing off on any of the actions of smoking, but to take a more dangerous, form of suicidal action, I'm more convinced on the externality, meaning just increasing your probability of death.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's got to be really big before I can possibly see any excuse for breaking what I think should be a very hard line against having the state involved in this stuff.
I want to come back to the remark you made about Kip Viscusi that he has found, and he's found that people overestimate the dangers of smoking. I think the defenders of soft paternalism would say, well, but that's a good thing. It's good to overestimate it. What's your reaction to that?
Well, we go back again to the emotional tax. It means certainly that the smokers who continue smoking bear this cost of thinking how awful it is for themselves over and over again as they smoke. And the objective is not to maximize lifespan. The objective is to maximize, the size of the human choice set. So I mean, I don't think, I think that they're mistaken to think that this emotional tax, without any offsetting government revenues, is an obvious win.
Let's talk about some of the political lessons here. So, in most areas, you'd be opposed to these kind of government interventions, campaigns, whatever you want to call these, encouragements, or use of the framework of choice, giving people one kind of choice before another in hopes that they'll make that choice rather than reordering that where they might make the wrong choice. What do you think the hopes are for the political economy of these issues? You mentioned earlier that we went down the slippery slope with cigarette taxation, and we started off by just discouraging, and then we led to stigmatization, and then we're now in a much different regulatory mode. Presumably, part of that regulatory mode part of that change came from a change in the body politic, who, perhaps influenced by the stigma, sort of piled on and said, "Come on, let's really solve this problem." What do you think about ways that we can protect ourselves from government paternalism run amok?
Right. I think one of the things that sort of is particularly dangerous at this point in time is sort of the traditional. Well, let's not say traditional. Let's say in the Goldwater Reagan era, the party that at least nominally stood for restrictions on government has been in power for a long time, which naturally makes it much less enthusiastic about restrictions on government.
You've noticed that, yeah, me too.
It's
depressing.
So I think that sort of, and as a result, there hasn't been the sort of thing that we had between 1955 and 1985 of having a growing political movement oriented towards freedom. And it's hard to think of who is really sort of strongly speaking for the liberty side of things in today's political spectrum. So that's one thing that disturbs me. The second thing, which is I think very interesting, has been a changing of power between industry groups and sort of private social entrepreneurs. And you see this in the victory of the health lobby over the cigarette companies. I think if you looked at the world in 1950, the thought that a bunch of doctors and other health advocates were going to bring down big tobacco would have struck you as being absurd. Big tobacco was the one who actually knew how to form public opinion and protect their interests, not the private entrepreneurs. This is a phenomenon that isn't just limited to cigarettes. In context after context, I think of an area that's very close to my own research, the sea change in development, where we've essentially gone from a world in which people pretty much were able to do whatever they wanted with their property in 1960 to a world in which almost every abutter particularly on the coasts, particularly in sort of the fancier areas. But pretty much every abutter feels like he has veto rights over every project. Now, this sea change in the
when you say abutter, you mean people neighbors,
who live next to people who live remotely in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Right. This has been accompanied by a incredible reduction in the number of new permits that's not in any sense explained by a lack of land. It's been associated with vastly rising housing prices that come from restrictions on supply. This change has been accomplished in part because sort of the traditional developer's ability to, by hook or by crook, smooth things over with the local city has been completely stopped by this combination of homeowners allying themselves with environmentalists who have sort of created this view that stopping development is an incredibly good thing for the world, presumably because it does something for nature.
That's a bizarre idea.
And this has been sort of an incredible change that we've seen, and one with huge consequences for the country. But we've had almost no public debate on it in some sense because the environmental/homeowners groups have really sort of dominated public discourse in a way that's similar to the way that the health professionals have dominated in the cigarette context.
Yeah, and you raise a really it's a fantastic observation, a really fascinating one. Clearly, it's sometime in America's past, maybe before 1955, maybe before 1935, maybe before 1900, the default political belief was government doesn't belong in our business in these ways, telling me what to eat, telling me what to how to spend my spare time, my leisure time, and kind of ironic actually. We have much more skepticism about government coercion of sexual activity today than we had in say 1850, but we've reversed and given government. So the government, most people think government should stay out of the bedroom, but it's in the kitchen.
Exactly.
Government's crowded out of the bedroom and somehow wandered in over by the refrigerator to keep an eye on me. And it just, I guess my thought is, I tend to perhaps naively hope that we'll have a revision in constitutional beliefs that government should do X or Y, but it really is probably going to have to come from the culture. It's going to have to come from the philosophy and norms that we believe in as Americans about the proper role of government, and I think we have a lot of work to do.
Well, I think there is at least this great tradition of caring about liberty, which came to America in part through the fight with religious coercion, and in part from the Scottish Enlightenment through Witherspoon to Madison, that gave these wonderful sort of Scottish Enlightenment skepticism about government, which so infuses our Constitution and is so much of a part of sort of traditional American political thinking. I think the strength of that tradition means that if there are enough sort of pro-liberty entrepreneurs out there, there's plenty to tap into. I think the battle is by no means lost, and I think when you sort of make the case that freedom is really the most important thing, I think that really does resonate with most Americans. But you need to actually keep on making that case. I mean, you need to keep on emphasizing that when you're doing something to try and restrict people's choices or try to let the government into people's minds to try and mess with their decisions about ice cream, that really is favoring the state over the individual. It really is actually going against the grain of America's 400-year tradition of liberty. And I think the important thing is that the entrepreneurs of liberty go out there and argue that, even in cases that don't affect them personally. But every time there's a restriction on liberty, that's something to be at least questioned.
It's wonderfully said. My guest today has been Edward Glaeser, the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics. Please visit EconTalk.org, EconTalk.org for links to this podcast, to comment on this podcast, and to find other podcasts on other topics. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening.